Hello everyone, my name is Arzi. I'm a PhD student in strategy at INSEAD. In my research, I study strategy questions with implications for firms and policymakers in the context of emerging markets. This is a quick snapshot of my research portfolio. There are two research streams, one in health, the other in finance. In today's quick video summary, we will focus on project number 1, which studies the effects of a pandemic-induced demand shock on the changes in market structure in India's influenza vaccines market. This is a joint work with Chirantan Chatterjee from Ahmedabad, Mate Drev from Georgia Tech, and Anant Mishra from University of Minnesota. The research question we tackle in this paper is interdisciplinary. Consequently, we look at the problem from the multiple lenses of strategy, public policy, and supply chain and production literature. Despite decades of medical and technological innovation, pandemics remain a grand societal challenge today. The Institute of Disease Modeling recently conducted a simulation. If the 1918 flu pandemic were to reoccur today, it would lead to a loss of 33 million lives globally within 6 months of its outbreak. From simulation to the real world. This is an image from the World Health Organization that shows the number of countries affected by the H1N1 pandemic of 2009 and 10. From its initial outbreak in Mexico in April 2009, to the official end of the pandemic in August 2010, this pandemic had affected over 200 countries globally. While it is known as a global problem, the challenge is particularly acute in emerging economies where bulk of the world's population resides, but spending on vaccines is limited given the lack of resources. But what happens in emerging economies also matters for developed economies given the interdependent nature of risks that pandemics bring to the world. In this paper, we look at this problem from the perspective of two important stakeholders. First, firms, both domestic and foreign multinational firms that operate in emerging economies. And second, the government. We look at two specific research questions. First, how do the differential incentives of domestic and foreign firms operating in the vaccines market of an emerging economy make them behave differently in the wake of a pandemic-induced demand shock? Second, to what extent do targeted policy instruments such as advanced market commitments, i.e. AMCs, incentivize these domestic firms to bring new vaccine products to the market? An AMC is a legally binding agreement that sponsors such as governments or transnational organizations commit to manufacturing firms to partly or fully finance purchases of vaccines at a predetermined prices. The intuition of taking away some of the market demand risk from manufacturing firms is very similar to the power purchase agreements that occur in electricity industry. These PPAs are signed by the electricity distribution companies with the electricity production companies to buy fully or partly electricity units that will be generated in future at a predetermined price. The mechanism rests upon the minimization of market demand risk. To examine these research questions, we analyze detailed purchasing data of monthly sales of all vaccines in India. We have got information on 20 vaccines markets, such as influenza, pneumonia, measles, etc. These information are available for 71 months from April 2007 until February 2013. This gives us 26 months of data before pandemic, 15 months during pandemic, and 30 months after the pandemic. In total, we have 1,365 market month observations to analyze. Using these data, we construct the main outcome of interest, which is the foreign firm's market share for every vaccine market in each month. The identification strategy in this paper relies upon the exogenous demand shock that was created by the H1N1 pandemic of 2009 and 10. We employ difference in differences estimation approach to tease out the effects of the pandemic shock on the changes in foreign firms' market share in influenza vaccines market relative to non-influenza vaccines market in the period after the shock compared to the period before the shock. The regression model is fairly straightforward. We have panel data model with market fixed effects to account for market-specific unobserved heterogeneity and time dummies to account for time-specific unobserved characteristics that are common to all markets. Beta 2 is the main coefficient of interest. This is the DID estimator. It estimates the extent to which the foreign firm's market share change in influenza vaccines market relative to non-influenza vaccines market in the period after the shock compared to the period before the shock. Let's start by looking at the descriptive patterns that emerge from the raw data. In Indian influenza vaccines market, the foreign firm's market share fell from an average of 90% before pandemic to almost 60% during pandemic. In contrast, in Indian non-influenza vaccine markets, we do not see any such decline in the foreign firm's market share, either during pandemic or after pandemic. These are the results obtained from the differences analysis. The results show that the foreign firm's market share in influenza vaccines market relative to non-influenza vaccines market fell by 18 percentage points in the period during pandemic compared to the period before pandemic. These results are robust if we use alternative estimation models such as generalized linear model fractional logit because the outcome variable ranges from 0 to 1. These results are also robust if the market share is computed by quantities in addition to by revenues. We conduct robustness tests by using alternative estimation methodologies that do not rely upon the assumption of parallel trends. Here, I will quickly summarize one such robustness test that we do by employing synthetic control method. This method takes away researchers' discretion in selecting the control group and lets a data-driven optimization procedure to come up with the counterfactual called the synthetic control. In these plots, the blue solid line represents the foreign firm's market share in the treated group, i.e. influenza vaccines market. The synthetic control method gives non-negative weights to each of the other 19 vaccine markets such that the foreign firm's market share in the synthetic control is closest to the foreign firm's market share in the treated group, i.e. influenza vaccines market, in the period prior to the shock. The closer this difference before the shock is closer to 0, the better the quality of synthetic control is. After the shock, if there is a sizable gap between the treated group and the synthetic control, that gap can be attributed to the shock under investigation. Here, we see that the foreign firm's market share in the treated group, that is the influenza vaccines market, fell considerably compared to the synthetic control. The inference drawn from this method is very much consistent with the inference drawn from the difference in differences analysis. Next, we examine the impact of AMCs that were awarded to a few, but not all domestic firms. Intriguingly, we find no evidence supporting that the firms that received AMCs performed materially better than the firms that did not receive AMCs. We qualify, however, in the paper that due to data limitations, this analysis is still exploratory in nature and more work remains to be done. A quick recap of the main results. We saw that a pandemic-induced demand shock leads to significant changes in market structure. However, these changes are driven by differences in firm behavior of domestic and foreign multinational firms. Domestic firms gain market share, foreign firms lose market share. We also saw that there is no evidence suggesting that the firms that received AMCs performed materially better than the firms that did not receive AMCs. More empirical work needs to be done in the context of emerging economies, teasing out the conditions under which AMCs may work better and also teasing out conditions under which AMCs may prove to be inadequate as policy instruments. The timing at which AMCs are awarded is a crucial question for future research. In sum, there we are. This paper tackles what is a grand challenge at the intersection of business and society. We try to contribute by developing a better understanding of how differential incentives of domestic and foreign multinational firms in the vaccine markets of an emerging economy may play out an important role in bringing new vaccine products to the market. The mechanisms or channels at play, which we discuss at length in the paper, are differences in consumer affordability and willingness to pay in developed economies and emerging economies. Second, differences in managerial attention, as domestic firms and foreign multinational firms face different kinds of pressures from their respective home country governments, and also differences in demand from transnational organizations such as the World Health Organization to donate part of their vaccines to the least developed countries in contexts such as pandemics. And third, differences in fixed costs versus variable costs between incumbents in the market and new entrants. That's all for the quick video summary today. Thank you for your time. The full paper is available at the URL shown on the slide. If you have any questions or comments, please email me at arzi.adbi@insead.edu. Thank you and have a good day.